This hearing of the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission, the Ortega government, and the human cost of repression in Nicaragua, political prisoners, will come to order. And good afternoon to everybody. We are gathered here today to examine the extreme political repression, including beatings, torture, the disappearance of and incarceration of political prisoners, and the pervasive suppression of democracy and the rule of law perpetrated by Nicaraguan President Daniel Ortega. We will hear in particular from the courageous wives of two of those political prisoners, candidates for the presidency of Nicaragua, as they give compelling personal testimony about the fate of their husbands and insight into the cruelty of the Ortega regime. Speaking of her husband, Felix Maradiaga, Berta Valle, in her written statement tells us that, and I quote, "For years, Felix has been the target of attacks by the Ortega regime because he speaks truth to power. He has been beaten, confined to house arrest, and threatened. For months, he endured 24/7 surveillance by the police. They have tried again and again to silence him, but he never stands down," close quote. Likewise, Victoria Cardenas also tells us that because her husband, Juan Sebastian Chamorro, dares to speak out against Ortega's oppression, quote, "The regime has also persecuted and harassed me and my family. They have brought a civil case against me, my sister, and my mother, which would take away all of my mother's assets. They have brought a criminal case against me, and there is an open warrant for my arrest. It is clear that Ortega is using every part of Nicaragua's institutions, including its judicial system, to not only persecute those who challenge the government, but also their family members," close quote. One thing I will note about this cruelty is that it is consistent cruelty. Political prisoners span the gamut of activists on both the political left, often dissident, Sandinistas themselves, to those on the political right. Some are motivated by a commitment to religious principle, such as the social teachings of the Catholic Church. Others who have been arrested come from indigenous groups like the Rama or Afro-Nicaraguan Creole from the Caribbean coast. Some have remained independent in their opposition. Others have decided to put aside their political differences to create a broad blue and white coalition, or UNAB by its Spanish acronym. Such is the case, for example, of two political prisoners, as I just mentioned, and their wives are here, Felix Maradiaga and Juan Sebastian Chamorro, and they will be providing their testimony within a few moments. What they do have in common, no matter what the differences are, is a commitment to democratic principles and a resistance to tyranny. All these democracy fighters, left, right, and center, have incurred the wrath of this one man and his closest allies, including Daniel Ortega's wife, Rosario Murillo. 37 years ago, in May of 1984, I should say, a bipartisan group of 4 congressmen, Frank Wolf, Tony Hall, Bob McEwen, and I, traveled to Nicaragua to meet with Ortega and some of his closest henchmen, including Interior Minister Tomas Borge and church leaders, including Miguel Obando. Somebody could unmute themselves. We confronted Ortega over a broad range of human rights abuses, including systematic torture and murder. During the 2-hour confrontation, Ortega served us water. 3 of us drank what we were served, but not Tony Hall. And I have never been sicker in my life. Those of us who drank the water all came down with a debilitating stomach pain, which remained with us for weeks on end. I lost close to 20 pounds during the ordeal. Only Tony, who had not taken the water, remained unaffected. Thus, I could say I have at least some very modest personal understanding, but deep empathy with those student protesters who were also sickened by tainted food that they were given by agents of the Sandinista government when protests began in 2018. Unfortunately, however, it is the bravery, the tenacity, and willingness to sacrifice of these Nicaraguan students and others like our witnesses who resist the regime that will ultimately bring about democratic change. They should know that the United States stands unequivocally with them and their noble commitment to democracy and respect for universally recognized human rights. And to this end, these Nicaraguan democracy advocates should be inspired as we all should be inspired by the citizen protests that we are witnessing today in Havana and throughout Cuba. For it was the communist regime in Cuba that first enabled Ortega and his Sandinistas to come to power in the 1970s during its first iteration. It was Castro's Cuba which spread its misery and its malign influence throughout Latin America, including in Venezuela, and actively conspired against democratic regimes, including revolutionary violence and terrorism, which has resulted in death, destruction, and despotism. Hopefully, those days are ending, and that soon the purveyors of violence will be held to account for their atrocities and their crimes against humanity. Something I hope for is that peaceful democratic change will come to Cuba and Nicaragua and in Belarus and in China and elsewhere. I would like to thank all of our witnesses for testifying and also give special recognition to Jared Genser for his great help in bringing the wives to our commission to testify. I would also especially like to thank Bianca Jagger for her strong leadership and for accepting my invitation to testify. In 1998, Bianca testified at one of my hearings on Srebrenica and gave extraordinary witness to the betrayal of Bosnian Muslims who were killed en masse, a genocide, in July of 1995. I now yield to my friend and colleague, co-chair Jim McGovern of Massachusetts.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I join Co-Chair Smith in welcoming the witnesses and those watching online today. As we discuss the issue of the human rights crisis in Nicaragua, and just as a bit of housekeeping, I think we should, as we move forward with future hearings, there are some people on this panel, one person in particular who will be speaking in Spanish. The House has approved other platforms in which we can have simultaneous translation. I think it would be helpful not only for us, but also for the witness to be able to understand what others are saying. So as we go forward, we might want to consider that. I want to start by expressing my deep respect and admiration for the many brave Nicaraguan victims, human rights organizations, journalists, and activists who have denounced and documented the awful human rights abuses committed since the current crisis began in April of 2018. These are people who have been putting their lives and well-being on the line from the very beginning. It is due to their efforts that international bodies like the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights have been able to compile comprehensive and damning reports like the one issued last October on persons deprived of liberty in Nicaragua. Sadly, many of these brave people have had to flee their country. Those who remain in Nicaragua are so vulnerable that I have been advised not to name them or mention their organizations today, because having a member of the U.S. Congress shine a light on their work in a public event could put them at even greater risk. Several declined to participate in this hearing to avoid giving the Nicaraguan authorities an excuse to go after them. The situation today is far worse now than in September of 2018, when I led the first hearing in this commission on Nicaragua. Then students and campesinos were at the forefront, motivated by the unfulfilled ideals of the Sandinista revolution, angry about the April crackdown, but also determined and full of hope. Their peaceful civic movement was a breath of fresh air. It is unfortunate that young people seem to be playing less of a leadership role now, and I regret that they're not represented here today. But during the last 2 months, the Nicaraguan state, led by President Daniel Ortega and Vice President Rosario Murillo, has detained and imprisoned at least 27 leading figures from across the political spectrum, including the husbands of 2 of the witnesses today. I know some of those imprisoned. I've known them for decades. Without objection, I ask that their names be included in the record. In response, hundreds of people who supported the Nicaraguan Revolution in the 1980s have publicly condemned the escalating repression and widespread violation of human rights and the efforts to shut down all dissent. And without objection, I ask that the sign-on statements be entered into the record. And I take the opportunity to reiterate what I said in 2018. As someone who strongly opposed the Contra War more than 30 years ago, the Nicaragua of today is not what I was rooting for. Daniel Ortega and his wife, who once stood against Somoza's oppression, have become the oppressors. Their authoritarian turn long predates the current crackdown and is a tragedy for the Nicaraguan people. Our solidarity must be with all those who are resisting their betrayal. This brings me to the question of what the U.S. government and Congress can do that will be constructive. In the 3 years since our last hearing, the main response to Nicaragua's return to dictatorship has been to impose economic sanctions. I personally am a believer in targeted sanctions, but they don't work in isolation. I do not support the so-called maximum pressure campaigns, the go-to approach for many in Congress. Imposing crushing across-the-board economic hardship on entire populations because of the sins of their leaders is a form of collective punishment that succeeds only in deepening humanitarian crises and increasing forced migration. What I do hope to see are coordinated multilateral initiatives that combine targeted sanctions, use of the UN and inter-American human rights system, enforcement of anti-corruption laws, auditing and strict conditioning of loans, keeping media in business, and I'm sure we can get creative here. What would be a mistake, though, would be to pretend that this crisis is just about ending the extended power grab by Ortega and Murillo. The strategies they have used to consolidate power, politicizing the judiciary, changing electoral rules in their favor, criminalizing speech and dissent on national security grounds, unleashing police on protesters, none of it is unique to them. Just last month, this commission reviewed the attacks on judicial independence throughout Central America. The Cold War is over. What is happening in Nicaragua is the struggle between authoritarianism and democracy. I yield back.
Thank you very much, Co-Chair McGovern. I'd like to now recognize Mario Diaz-Balart. I believe he's here. Mario?
He just got an email saying he cannot join again.
Any Democrats on? I'm looking on the list.
I see Mr. LaHood is on the line. I see.
Yes, he is. I will yield to him then next. I wanted to go to the Democrat first, back and forth. But I'd like to yield to Darren LaHood, such time as he makes it so.
Well, thank you very much, Chairman McGovern and Ranking Member Smith, for having this very important hearing today. And I'm also a proud member of the Lantos Commission, and thank you for doing this today and for the valuable testimony of our witnesses that we'll hear from today. I want to just acknowledge one of our witnesses today, and that's Rafael Estrada. I've known Rafael and have been familiar with his work and advocacy for some time. Rafael is a Nicaraguan American and president of the Free and Fair Foundation, Nicaraguans for Security and Prosperity Foundation. He currently resides in Galesburg, Illinois, which is near my hometown of Peoria. And he's got a unique story. Having fled his native country of Nicaragua at the age of 12, Rafael has been committed to fight for democracy, free and fair elections, and articulating human rights abuses throughout Nicaragua. After the socio-political crisis began in 2018, he increased his commitment and advocacy for human rights and regularly meets with members of Congress and government officials regarding the human rights abuses in Nicaragua. Mr. Estrada's foundation, which I'm familiar with, has provided aid to Nicaraguan refugees in several countries near Nicaragua and sponsors medical attention and medicine for political prisoners who have suffered torture while in custody. Rafael is a graduate of Augustana College and North Park University in Illinois, and also serves as an auxiliary lieutenant on the Knox County Sheriff's Department. And he is a businessman and philanthropist, providing aid to schools and churches in Nicaragua. I want to thank the Lantos Commission for inviting Rafael today to testify, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you to my good friend and colleague, and thank you for introducing one of our distinguished witnesses. Are there any other members on the line that would like to be recognized? If not, I'd like to introduce our first panel, and then we will take a break. Unfortunately, we have a series of votes, 3 of them, but I would like to at least introduce our distinguished panelists before going to that thing. Yeah. Okay, our first witness needs no introduction. Bianca Jagger is founder, president, and chief executive of the Bianca Jagger Human Rights Foundation, which she established in 2005 to be a force for change and a voice for the most vulnerable. Ms. Jagger has committed her life to defending human rights, civil liberties, peace, social justice, and environmental protection throughout the world. She works to end violence against women and girls, to abolish capital punishment, and advocates for the rights of indigenous peoples and future generations. She is Goodwill Council of Europe, I should say, Goodwill Ambassador, member of the Executive Leadership Council for the Amnesty International USA, and IUCN Bond Challenge Ambassador. She has received numerous prestigious awards, including the Right Livelihood Award 2004, and also known as the Alternative Nobel Prize. As I mentioned earlier, we've had, and not just me, but others have had her provide testimony in the past. And again, I thank her for being a witness today at this critical hour. I'll then hear from Berta Valle, who is well-known Nicaraguan communicator and the wife of Felix Maradiaga, presidential candidate, political prisoner, and human rights defender. In 2018, the political persecution that her husband faced forced Ms. Valle, along with her daughter and mother-in-law, into exile abroad, where she lost all of her assets, employment, and social connections. She has not been able to return to Nicaragua. During her exile, she has promoted and created spaces for dialogue on social networks and other media to announce what is happening in Nicaragua. As a result of the enforced disappearance of her husband, she coordinates the defense teams that support him. In her 15 years of experience as an activist, she has emphasized issues of children's rights, social issues, and fundamental human rights. Then we'll hear from Victoria Cardenas, who is the wife of Cardenas, I should say, who is the wife of presidential candidate and former political prisoner, now current political prisoner, Juan Sebastian Camorra. She and her family have faced oppression by the Ortega regime for her husband's activities since 2018. Mr. Cardenas, Mrs. Cardenas and her family have been the subject of politically motivated court proceedings and repression, including being targeted with an active arrest warrant. She and her has an 18-year-old daughter and is now dedicated to announcing the human rights violations that her family and so many, many others suffer. Congressman LaHood has already introduced Rafael Estrada, so I thank him for that. And then we have Ortega Fornos, who's coordinator of Acción Penal, an organization that works to ensure that human and constitutional rights of political prisoners are protected through access to free and quality legal defense and document violations of due process and human rights by the government of Nicaragua. He's a lawyer and public notary with 18 years of experience, specializing in criminal law and criminal procedural law. Former public prosecutor and with more than 10 years of experience in the Nicaraguan criminal justice system, Mr. Fornos currently serves as the coordinator of Acción Penal, working to provide legal defense for political prisoners and legal representation for victims of the repression of the socio-political crisis in Nicaragua. He holds a degrees in legal strategy and policy from the Center for Hemispheric Defense Studies at the National University. This witness will speak when we get to him in the order in Spanish, and we'll have an interpreter who provides the commission with translation for those who don't speak Spanish. Now, unfortunately, Jim, I think you'll agree we need to move over to the Capitol to vote, but we will come right back. We're in a short recess, and I apologize to our distinguished witnesses for the delay, but we look forward to hearing what you have to say. We stand in recess. You know, I see my friend and colleague Jim McGovern is back on, and I just got back as well. So we'll resume the hearing right now, and we'll begin with Bianca Jagger. Thank you again for testifying.
Thank you for having me. I will first, can they hear me?
Yes, we can now. Thank you.
Thank you. I will first like to thank co-chairs Christopher Smith and co-chair James McGovern, as well as the other members of the Lantos Commission for inviting me. I would like to say that it is a a pleasure and a privilege to be before you again, Congressman Smith. I remember well when I testified before you years ago and before Congressman Tom Lantos when he was alive. Distinguished members of the US Congress present here in this room, I am testifying in my capacity as founder and president of the Bianca Jagger Human Rights Foundation, and I wish I could be there in person, but unfortunately I am in the UK and not able to be there. On 19th of July, 1979, 42 years ago, Anastasio Somoza was toppled by the people of Nicaragua. The corrupt Somoza dynasty was one of the oldest tyrannies in Latin America. The triumph of the Sandinista revolution brought hope and joy to millions of people in Nicaragua and throughout the world, including me. We believed that the revolution was going to bring freedom, justice, and democracy, but that was not to be. Daniel Ortega and his brother Humberto co-opted the leadership of the Sandinista National Liberation Front, and to our great shock, Daniel Ortega betrayed the principle that inspired that revolution. Through his years in power, he has dismantled all legal and democratic institutions in Nicaragua. His objective is to perpetuate his power at any cost by establishing a new tyrannical dynasty. Ortega's brutal and relentless repression are comparable or worse than Somoza's. In Nicaragua today, we have a state of terror. Daniel Ortega represses the people with his police, army, paramilitary forces, better known as mobs or death squads, party structures, neighborhood committees that force people to spy on each other, and the corrupt and subservient judicial system. These are the same structures that were employed to repress the nonviolent uprising and to murder protesters in 2018 with absolute impunity. Gross and systematic human rights violations have been extensively documented by international organizations such as the UN High Commissioner on Human Rights, the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, among others. The interdisciplinary group of independent experts established by the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights have concluded that crimes against humanity have been perpetrated by the Ortega regime. The IACHR reported that up to 8 of August 2019, 328 people have been murdered. And it is important to point out that in September 2018, the Ortega regime expelled all of the international human rights organizations and have not allowed them to return. Neither has Amnesty or Human Rights Watch. In addition, the Nicaraguan human rights organizations have been stripped of their legal status, their offices confiscated, and many of the staff have been forced into exile. Among the most egregious human rights violations committed by the Ortega and Murillo regime since instructions given by the Minister of Health in April 2018 to deny medical attention to wounded protesters, often leaving them to die at the doorsteps of hospital. Alvarito Conrado, a 15-year-old boy who was shot while distributing water to protesters, is among the victims of this murderous policy. Every time I remember his case, it brings tears to my eyes to think what happened to this young man. He is a symbol of Ortega's murderous repression. Alvarito Conrado became a hero to the Nicaraguan nonviolent protest. Doctors that defied the minister's order and assisted the wounded were fired. Another unspeakable policy is the shoot to kill, a strategy employed by the Ortega regime to repress protesters, denounced by Amnesty International. I was in Nicaragua on the 30th of May 2018. Erica Guevara Rosas, director of Amnesty International America, and I participated in the Mother's Day March, the largest peaceful demonstration in recorded history in Managua. That day, I witnessed the shoot-to-kill policy in action when a sniper opened fire against the participants, aiming directly at their heads and chests. That demonstration, that march, by the way, you had older people, younger people, families. It was a peaceful demonstration. That day, There were 19 people who were murdered and 185 people who were wounded. Today, human rights violations affect practically all sectors of Nicaraguan society. As of mid-July 2021, there are some 147 non-political prisoners in Nicaragua. Political leaders have been jailed, including 6 presidential candidates, de facto eliminating any meaningful opposition leadership. These leaders represented politicians, members of civil society, women, students, campesinos, journalists, and members of the private sector. People from all walks of life, from the left to the right, including prominent former iconic Sandinista leaders that participated in the struggle against Somoza and that also took part in the operation to free Ortega from Somoza's prison. I'd like to point out to you that at last, when he's done this, he sort of helped us to convince those people on the left, who continue to have this romanticized idea of what Daniel Ortega and the revolution really mean. The latest round of abductions and detentions that began on the 28th of May include 6 leading presidential candidates: Juan Sebastián Chamorro, you will be listening to his wife; Cristiana Chamorro, Arturo Cruz, Medardo Mairena, you will be listening to his wife as well. Felix Maradiaga, you will be listening to his wife, and Miguel Mora. Leaders from all political spectrums: Violeta Granera, José Bernard Palais, Pedro Joaquín Chamorro, Suyen, private sector leaders, former First Lady, wife of President Norberto Alemán, sports journalists, staff of the Violeta Barrios Foundation. Daniel Ortega is denying access to lawyers, medical and humanitarian assistance, and family members to all those he's holding hostages. And I will not say prisoners, because we don't know where they are. The Ortega regime's cruel policy go against all international conventions and norms and basic humanity. Until now, no one knows their exact whereabouts or their condition, with the exception of Cristiana Chamorro, who is under house arrest. All we know about the others is that they were kidnapped and are being held hostage. Some of them have serious health issues. The dark shadow of possible torture in the prison, as previously reported by national and international human rights organizations, weigh heavily with their families. This prompted me to remember that back in early July 1979, I supported an appeal of the British Red Cross to assist the victims of the conflict in my native Nicaragua. I traveled to Managua on a fact-finding mission and requested the Somoza regime to be allowed to visit the prison. Somoza reluctantly granted me access to those prisons where he kept many of his political enemies. I would like to appeal here today to Daniel Ortega to grant me and other members of the human rights organization access to these prisons now. Other human rights violations that have not been adequately documented are the arbitrary detention and summary execution of poor farmers, campesinos, indigenous people, and Afro-descendants that are victims of the repression from Ortega's army in remote rural areas. Little is known about what takes place in those isolated areas. Journalists have been victims of a relentless persecution by the Ortega regime. Freedom of the press is under assault, and several well-known journalists are among the illegal detained. In addition, countless journalists have been forced to flee the country. Their facilities and sometimes their home have been ransacked and their property confiscated. The Chamorro family has been the target of Ortega and Murillo's personal revenge. Cristiana Chamorro is under house of arrest. Her brother, Pedro Joaquín, is among those held hostages, and Carlos Fernando, the younger brother and the most prominent Nicaraguan journalist, was forced into exile for the second time. They are all children of Pedro Joaquín Chamorro, a national hero, murdered by Somoza, and former president of Nicaragua, Violeta Barrios de Chamorro, who lies gravely ill without being able to tend to her. And one really important issue that I need to bring to you is that doctors, medical staff have been prosecuted, jailed, and exiled. Nearly 500 medical staff have been fired from public institutions, mainly related to the April 2018 uprising for upholding their Hippocratic oaths and tending to the wounded, but also because of disagreement of the reckless handling of the COVID-19 pandemic by the regime. Others have been forced into exile, are in hiding within the country, who are under constant surveillance. Ortega authoritarian rule is becoming a factor of destabilization for the Central American region, considering Central America interlinked trade and economic tie, as well as bad precedent for the rest of the region in terms of being an authoritarian regime. We should all be alarmed by the recent statement by Russian Minister of Defense regarding increased military ties with the Ortega regime, adding to the 80 million in tanks and Russian arms sale in the recent past, as well as the July 19 statement of the Russian Minister of Foreign Affairs, where he referred to the strategic relation between Russia and the Ortega regime. I should also mention that Ortega's regime is one of a handful of countries that recognize South Ossetia, Abkhazia, and Crimea. I believe that Ortega is trying to recreate a Cold War scenario and use it to seize advantage. What I would like to say is to ask you that if on the 2nd of August 2021, the last date that the electoral calendar allows the registration of candidates, Ortega is unwilling to comply to 5 points, the international community should not and cannot recognize this electoral farce. I would like to bring to you 5 points which are really important for the November 21 electoral process to be legitimate, which I don't think it can possibly be. These 5 conditions: immediate release of all presidential candidates, political, civil society, students, poor farmers, campesinos, and private sector leaders, and journalists currently imprisoned under bogus and fraudulent charges such as high treason and money laundering. B, immediate withdrawal of all the spurious inhibitions that will prevent the participation of the above-mentioned presidential candidate and candidates for other popularly elected positions. The immediate restitution of all civil and political liberties of the Nicaraguan citizens, including free mobilization, freedom of assembly, and the free exercise without harassment or persecution of the activities of members of the press. Immediate cessation of all acts of repression and intimidation that the regime is carrying out with total impunity with the help of its police, army, paramilitary forces, and mob of controlled sympathizers, and last but not least, its corrupt judicial system. Undertake a non-negotiable commitment to submit the electoral process to broad international and national observation and allow the entry of international human rights organizations such as the Office of the UN High Commissioner, the Inter-American Commission for Human Rights, and a special envoy from the Secretary General, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and possibly myself, representing the Bianca Jagger Human Rights Foundation. The Ortega regime has done everything to undermine this election, and I think that we should really come to the conclusion, Congressman, that this is a farce, that this is another fraudulent election in the making, and that there is no possibility at this stage, in the conditions that we have in Nicaragua, to have an election, and that we need all the help that we can get from you, members of Congress, and in a coordinated way work with the European Union, with the members of the OAS, and with Canada. It is time to impose the democratic charter on Nicaragua, and it is time to suspend the DR CAFTA from Nicaragua. I thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to come to speak to you. And please do not remember that the NICA Act needs to be fully implemented, particularly the part pertaining to further scrutinies of funds coming from the IFI, IMF, IADB, and World Bank, and sanctions over corrupt individuals. The Renaissance Act should be approved and implemented as soon as possible with this and an extensive legally mandated investigation of the corruption of the Ortega family and circle. Nicaragua is the only one of 20 countries in the world that has a free trade agreement with the US, which according to Freedom House is not free. This is unsustainable as a country without a rule of law. cannot responsibly comply with the obligations of labor, competition, environmental, or any kinds of rule with a notorious corrupt and partisan judiciary, with a dictator and a mafia-like government. Ortega will self-exclude the country from this important treaty, further affecting hundreds of thousands. I thank you very much for indulging me to be able to present to you my testimony, and there will be some more in the evening, and I ask you respectfully that you submit that to your records. Thank you very much.
Bianca Jagger, thank you so much for that extraordinarily comprehensive, passionate defense of the Nicaraguan people, which you have done all over the world, but for your native country that you love so much and the people you love so much. That was an extraordinary testimony you have provided. And I hope there are a number of people in the news media that I know are tuned in, watching this. And I do hope they amplify in a very, very serious way the concerns you have raised, including the idea of Ortega allowing you and others into the prisons. I think that's I think our commission, we could put together a letter supporting that and other things, of course. But I mean, the sooner the better to mitigate the harm that's being done every single minute of every single hour to these hostages, as you call them, that are being held by Ortega. So thank you for that testimony once again, because you've done it so often for so many decades. Thank you for bearing witness to the truth so eloquently. I would like to now yield to Berta Valle for her testimony and thank her so much for being here to speak out on behalf of her husband.
Thank you for your words. Thank you for this space. Chairman McGovern and Chairman Smith, distinguished members and honored guests, I'm humbled to appear before the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission today to discuss the ongoing crisis in Nicaragua. I thank you for creating the space for this discussion, and I'm grateful for your ongoing commitment to the amplifying and defending human rights in Nicaragua. My name is Berta Valle. My husband, Felix Maradiaga, is one of the presidential candidates and opposition leaders that was arrested and disappeared by the Ortega regime. Since June 8, Felix has been held by the regime without access to his family, lawyers, or doctor. We have not had any contact with him since his disappearance, and we worry every day for his physical and mental well-being. Later that same day, Victoria's husband was also disappeared. Since then, dozens of opposition leaders have been arrested and detained in the same way. It's very clear that Daniel Ortega will do anything he can to maintain his grip on power by arresting and leading presidential candidates and dozens of other critics. Ortega has shown the world that he cannot win elections and he cannot re-election if the opposition is allowed to participate. This oppression is not new. For years, Felix has been the target of attacks by the Ortega regime because he speaks truth to power. He has been beaten, confined to house arrest, and threatened. For months, he endured 24/7 surveillance by the police. They have tried again and again to silence him, but he never stand down. The repression became so severe that in 2018, I flew to Nicaragua with my 5-year-old daughter and mother-in-law. For 3 years, we have lived in exile as political refugees. While I am in the United States today, my heart and soul are in Nicaragua. I would like to tell you a little bit more about my husband. Felix has dedicated his entire life to Nicaragua and its people.
As young boy during the war, he saw how violence and conflict affected his family, especially his parents. His father had been a political prisoner, and his mother also suffered greatly. During these years, his mother feared for his life and felt obligated to send Felix to the United States, where he lived as a minor in exile. This experience as a witness and a refugee made Felix committed to the cause of human rights, nonviolent social change, and democracy. He returned to Nicaragua as an adolescent, where he finished his study and dedicated his professional life to public service. He found a particular passion in the area of dismobilization and disarmament of ex-combatants, where he was deeply involved in the peacemaking process throughout the country. Through this work, he traveled to all corners of Nicaragua, meeting Nicaraguans from all walks of life, including those more marginalized in our society. As a teacher, he spent over 10 years shaping the life of young people. In his teaching, he emphasized the importance of nonviolent change, peaceful resistance, and civilian democracy. I'm certain that Felix's commitment to this principle can be traced back in his experience at a young age. For him, it has always been more than just a curriculum to teach, more than an academic theory. He has a profound, intangible commitment to these principles. He lives his life in service of them. It is this commitment to these exact same principles and his refusal to be silenced that the Ortega regime arrested Felix at the beginning of this brutal crackdown on opposition before November elections. Since June, more than 26 opposition leaders have been arrested and placed under house arrest or disappeared, including presidential candidates, political leaders, student activists, business people, union leaders, and former Sandinistas. The vast majority have been held without access to their families and lawyers. The regime won't even confirm where they are being held. Under the framework of international law, this form of an enforced disappearance is a form of cruel, denigrating, and inhuman treatment, which continues a form of torture the longer it persists. Because they have been disappeared for so long, in the case of our husbands for 43 days, this disappearance constitutes torture as a matter of international law. While our domestic lawyers continue to exhaust the legal resources available at the local level to access our husbands, we are calling on the international community to continue to pressure Ortega regime to release our husbands and all of the more than 140 political prisoners in Nicaragua. In my hand, I have a list of all the political prisoners that are held by the Ortega regime. And I'm asking that this list be included and recorded of today's hearing.
Without objection, Bertha, it will be in its full. Thank you.
Thank you. This week, as Victoria and I meet with policymakers, diplomats, and officials in Washington, we will be advocating for not just our husbands, but for all the political prisoners in Nicaragua. While my husband and Victoria's husband were competitors in the presidential primary, they are united by their vision of a better Nicaragua. While Daniel Ortega may try to divide the opposition by arresting and detaining his critics, this crackdown has only brought us closer together. And I'm grateful to Victoria for her support as we fight together for her husband's freedom. And we are more committed than ever before to a peaceful transition to democracy that the Nicaraguan people want and deserve. We stand in solidarity with all of the families of the political prisoners and with all those in Nicaragua who pray for a future where they can live in dignity and without fear. And we will not rest until our husbands are liberated and our dream for a free and prosperous Nicaragua are released. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so very much, Berta. And you know, when your husband sees the tape when he is freed, he will be so inspired by your love, your compassion, and your power. It is just, thank you so much. You and some of the other key leaders are the reason why Nicaragua will be free. So I can't thank you enough for testifying. I would like to now have Victoria Cardenas, if she would provide her testimony.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Chairman McGovern, Chairman Smith, and distinguished members for the opportunity to testify before the Lantos Human Rights Commission regarding the situation in Nicaragua. While the situation in Nicaragua has been dire for the last 3 years, the situation has deteriorated dramatically in the last 6 weeks. We urgently need the international community's help. My name is Victoria Cardenas. I appear before you today as a wife and a mother. I did not choose a life of politics or activism, but the circumstances in my country have given me no choice but to stand up and speak out against the oppression of the Ortega regime, which has detained and disappeared my husband, Juan Sebastián Chamorro, and more than 25 opposition activists in the last month. Our lives were turned upside down on June 8th. That afternoon, Juan received a summons to appear at the prosecutor's office for an interview on June 9th, the following day. Later that evening, around 7, 8 police patrol cars entered our neighborhood, and more than 40 armed agents began to jump over the wall to our property. They were so forceful and almost broke the gate trying to enter. As soon as they arrived, Juan put his hands above his head. They arrested him and took him in one of their patrol cars. Just like that, he was gone. We have not heard from him or had any contact with him in the last 43 days. For the next 4 hours, the police, armed with weapons, searched our home. I told them over and over, I will cooperate. I do not want violence. They cataloged everything in our home and took whatever they could find: papers, notebooks, computers, electronic devices. It was so inhuman and degrading. I felt violated. Since Juan's arrest, the Ortega regime has systematically violated all of his rights. The cases of Juan, Berta Valle's husband, Felix, and the other political prisoners are remarkably similar. We have identified at least 10 violations of international law in their cases. Ortega has completely eliminated any due process rights and manipulated Nicaragua's justice system to maintain his grip on power. First, both men were arrested without warrants. Our homes were also searched without warrants. Second, both men were disappeared, taken into custody to unknown locations without any legal basis whatsoever. Third, both men have been held without being able to access their counsel since they were detained over 1 month ago. Fourth, both men are being held without being able to have family access them at their place of detention. In fact, while we have heard rumors, the government has not even confirmed where they are being detained. Fifth, neither was brought promptly before a judge and allowed to challenge the lawfulness of their detentions. Sixth, neither was given a fair and public hearing. Seventh, the judges they were brought before were neither independent nor impartial. They simply did Ortega's bidding. Eighth, both Felix and Juan Sebastián were presumed guilty rather than innocent, as is required by law. by being sentenced to 90 days in jail despite having never been convicted of a crime. Both President Daniel Ortega and Vice President Rosario Murillo also referred to all the detained opposition leaders as terrorists and criminals, which constitute illegal interference with their cases because it puts pressure on the judiciary to convict them. Ninth, by being held disappeared and held extra legally, both men are being subject to cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment or punishment which constitute a form of torture. And 10th, they are being subject to arbitrary detention because there is in fact absolutely no legal basis for them to be detained. They are innocent. Since I've met my husband over 30 years ago, he has always fought for Nicaragua. He has always wanted to be involved in improving his country, contributing to its economic and social development, so that all Nicaraguans can live prosperous and peaceful lives of dignity. My husband is a peaceful and honest man, but Daniel Ortega feels threatened by him because he dares to speak out against the regime's oppression. For Juan's activism, the regime has also persecuted and harassed me and my family. They have brought a civil case against me, my sister, and my mother, which will take away all of my mother's assets. They have brought a criminal case against me, and there is an open warrant for my arrest. It is clear that Ortega is using every part of Nicaragua's institutions, including its judicial system, to persecute those who challenge the government and their families. It is very clear that this regime will target anyone who speaks out against it, as they have done with presidential candidates, student activists, journalists, business people, labor leaders, and others. And in turn, I will keep raising my voice until Juan and Felix and other political prisoners are released. I never thought that I would be here in Washington to testify before members of Congress. When my husband decided to run for the presidency, I pledged to support him, but I never expected I would be the one speaking on his behalf. But the events of the last few weeks have shown that we must do all we can to save democracy in Nicaragua. As a wife, mother, and proud Nicaraguan, I must do my part. And so I am here to appeal to you, honorable members of this commission, to join us in demanding that the Ortega regime releases our husbands and all the political prisoners in Nicaragua. Stand in solidarity with us, but also raise your voices and use your power to ensure that the world remains focused on the crisis in Nicaragua. The greatest fear of any political prisoner is to be forgotten. Please make sure that our husbands and the other 140 political prisoners of Daniel Ortega are not forgotten. I thank you, and I look forward to this discussion.
Thank you very much, Victoria. Again, a very, very passionate and very persuasive appeal for your husband and all the other hostages that are being held by Daniel Ortega. And with regards to being forgotten, absolutely not. Jared Genser, when he told my staff and I that he would be bringing you here, or at least bringing to Washington, D.C., my first reaction was, we need to hear you in a hearing, and you're doing it, and we will amplify this message, as aggressively as we can, because from your word, from your mouth to God's ears, it's amazing how patient you are in a way. You just all of you're suffering. I don't know how you sleep at night, and I'm sure you don't. But your husbands are so brave, as are you. So you're inspiring all of us to further action. And I do thank you for that, by bearing witness to this terrible truth of what's being done to your husband and husbands.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to now yield to Rafael Estrada for his testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman Smith, Mr. Chairman McGovern, and all of the members of this honorable commission, good afternoon. My name is Rafael Estrada, and I am honored to speak to your committee today. I am the founder of Nicaraguans for Security and Prosperity and currently serve as the foundation's president. Thank you for allowing me the opportunity to share with you our concerns regarding the gross human rights violations in Nicaragua. It is essential and necessary to hold these hearings and for you to continue to provide a venue for our voices, to stand against oppression, corruption, and tyranny for those who do not have the opportunity to speak for themselves. Thank you. The socio-political situation in Nicaragua continues to decay. The economy has plummeted. The judicial system has been politicized in an unprecedented manner, and transgressions by the national police occur daily. The current state of society in Nicaragua continues to get worse for its citizens as democracy slides further from reach and the roots of corruption and tyranny continue to hold, threatening future generations. Our foundation has reached out to Nicaraguan refugees in several countries, including Spain, Costa Rica, Nicaragua, and Panama, as well as some who reside here in the United States. Through this platform, we have provided much needed aid to those Nicaraguans who were persecuted and were forced to leave their homeland. However, we need your help in putting pressure on the current government to release all political prisoners, fight the brutality and corruption of the Ortega regime, and rightfully return democracy to the majority of Nicaraguans who yearn for freedom, support democratic values, and who want to install a credible and effective leadership that represents and works for the good of all Nicaraguans through free and fair elections. At this time, I would like to take this opportunity to mention the name of an American veteran who was killed in May of 2019. He was shot to death while in custody at the Modelo jail in Nicaragua. His name was Eddie Montes, a U.S. citizen and a veteran of the United States Navy. Regrettably, to this day, no one has been held accountable for his death, and I am afraid that little will be done. The situation in Nicaragua is reaching a flashpoint, which is more than likely to lead to more violence and destabilization of the country. The constant persecution of political opponents and independent journalists is unprecedented. Some of the political prisoners who have been released have now been recaptured and imprisoned without any form of due process, such as the case of Jaime Enrique Navarrete and Jose Santos Sanchez. They were both released from prison and given house arrest. Regrettably, they were both recaptured and jailed, and they continue to be there now and continue to be tortured. If a peaceful resolution to the current crisis is to be achieved, it must be through honest negotiations, which must be based on the immediate and unconditional release of all political prisoners, not just political leaders, who rightfully so must also be released. All political prisoners must be released. Those prisoners who come from humble means and were motivated by the pursuit of justice and not the pursuit of power, especially have to be released. Those who have no one to advocate for them. I truly hope that Nicaragua will once again be a peaceful and just member of the international community, a place where peace and justice reign for all citizens. A stable and democratic Nicaragua is important to the stability of the region and also to the United States. Stable and democratic Nicaragua will minimize the necessity for its citizens to flee their homeland and immigrate to other nations, including the US. However, this can only happen if free and fair elections are held. Elections that truly reflect the will of the Nicaraguan citizens. These elections must be predicated on the transparency of the process by which they are held, the engagement of national and international observers, such as the UN, OAS, and the Carter Center. It's imperative in order to guarantee a peaceful and democratic Nicaragua and a peaceful transition of government. As a leader, as the leader of the free world, the United States has an elemental role in finding a resolution to this crisis. However, the Ortega government is betting on the US current Biden administration to be complacent with the current situation in Nicaragua. We are confident that President Biden's administration will prove this theory of complacency to be wrong and will hold accountable President Ortega for his human rights abuses and crimes. Mr. Chairman and members of this committee, I urge you to continue your efforts to reach a peaceful resolution to the chaotic situation in Nicaragua. Hearings such as this one are essential in this process. Also, we urge the committee, Congress, and the Biden administration to apply all pressures available to them in order to persuade President Ortega to reconsider this path of violence and show good faith to the international community, and most importantly, to his fellow citizens, and release all political prisoners. This includes those citizens who were exercising their constitutional right to participate in the political arena, such as Arturo Cruz, Medardo Mairena, Juan Sebastián Chamorro, Felix Maradiaga, Miguel Mora, and all the other citizens who are held captive without justice. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you so very much for that testimony. It's very insightful and it's a call to action, and I do thank you for that. I would like to now yield to Mr. Fornos.
Buenas tardes, Co-Chair Smith, Co-Chair McGovern. Gracias por tener esta audiencia y por darme la oportunidad de dirigirme a ustedes. Soy Bianca Fornos, soy un abogado penalista de Nicaragua, represento a la organización Acción Penal, que es una iniciativa de sociedad civil creada por exfiscales del Ministerio Público de Nicaragua para defender presos políticos y a las víctimas de la represión estatal y paraestatal. Debo decir, como es de su conocimiento, que Nicaragua vive una de las más graves crisis de derechos humanos de su historia republicana desde abril del año 2018. Esto tenemos que verlo desde el regreso a la presidencia de Daniel Ortega en el año 2007. A partir de la llegada a la presidencia, desmantela la independencia institucional que se había construido en 16 años de democracia. Lo que se evidencia a partir de abril del año 2018. Los manifestantes que protestaron contra el gobierno fueron criminalizados mediante procesos penales ordenados por Ortega por motivaciones políticas a fin de evitar las expresiones de descontento popular que debilitan la legitimidad de su gobierno y su intención de perpetuarse en el poder. El gobierno de Ortega instrumentalizó el sistema de justicia penal en Nicaragua, de tal forma que lo utilizó como un órgano represor que actuaba de forma coordinada con fuerzas paraestatales, de tal suerte que la Policía Nacional realizaba acciones dirigidas a detener arbitrariamente a las personas que participan en las protestas cívicas. La Fiscalía realiza acusaciones infundadas en contra de activistas y líderes opositores. Por su parte, los jueces y magistrados no ejercen el control de legalidad de las actuaciones de la policía y de la Fiscalía. La Defensoría Pública ha dejado en indefensión a las personas acusadas. Este sistema representa la inexistencia del debido proceso y el Estado de Derecho en Nicaragua. Por ejemplo, los presos políticos no se les permite una comunicación libre y privada con sus abogados defensores. Los jueces excluyen pruebas importantes y vitales que desvirtúan las falsas acusaciones formuladas por los fiscales. El sistema penitenciario, que también forma parte de este sistema, no garantiza el respeto a la salud e integridad física de los presos políticos. Y eso quedó ampliamente demostrado con el asesinato del ciudadano norteamericano Eddie Montes, que en paz descanse. Dentro de las instalaciones carcelarias y por custodios del sistema penitenciario. Cabe mencionar que es un hecho que aún sigue en la impunidad. De igual forma, en el contexto de la pandemia, no se brinda a los presos políticos artículos necesarios para protegerse del COVID-19 y se ha tenido conocimiento de parte de familiares que han existido casos positivos de COVID-19 y otras enfermedades que requieren atención urgente y no se les da la atención médica requerida. Una de las experiencias más importantes que ha constatado Acción Penal es el costo humano de la represión estatal y que no alcanza solo a los presos políticos, sino que también alcanza a los familiares de presos políticos. Prueba de ella son las dos esposas de dos precandidatos que están en esta audiencia. De tal forma que al inicio de la crisis nos percatamos que la gran mayoría de las personas apresadas eran de escasos recursos económicos, que querían un cambio de rumbo en las decisiones del gobierno. Había madres, honorables coaches, que no tenían los recursos para transportarse desde su casa a los tribunales de justicia y llevaban la alimentación para sus familiares aún a costa de que ese día esas madres no comieran en sus casas. Eso generó la solidaridad de ciudadanos y de abogados defensores de presos políticos que aportamos y apoyamos para su transporte y alimentación. Esa realidad nicaragüense del 2018 y que sigue vigente hoy en el 2021 es la que nos inspira y nos motiva a continuar colaborando con nuestra población. Ante la crisis que se agudiza, nosotros como abogados defensores de presos políticos nos enfrentamos a graves riesgos y amenazas. Pretenden suspender nuestro ejercicio profesional y criminalizarnos bajo el argumento de que somos agentes extranjeros y traidores a la patria, porque nuestra labor consiste en documentar las graves violaciones a los derechos humanos que se cometen en Nicaragua y que son muy útiles para denuncias ante organismos internacionales, como sucede el día de hoy. De igual forma, es importante destacar que si criminalizan a los abogados, los presos políticos actuales y los que seguramente puedan venir, no van a contar con una defensa legal de su elección. Y por esa razón, los abogados, ante esta escalada represiva, hemos tomado la decisión, algunos, de irnos al exilio, porque no hay garantías de que haya un proceso justo para nosotros como abogados. Otra cosa importante es que ante las elecciones de este año, hemos destacado que la nueva ola represiva obedece a una estrategia claramente definida para inhibir de facto a candidatos potables a cargos de elección popular, no solo de la presidencia, sino de otros cargos importantes en el Congreso nicaragüense. Estrategia que viene desde la Asamblea Nacional mediante la aprobación de leyes punitivas que han sido utilizadas en la actualidad y que son ejecutadas por policías, fiscales, jueces, defensores públicos con una clara subordinación política al régimen de Daniel Ortega, vulnerando, además del derecho de estos ciudadanos, el derecho de todos los nicaragüenses a elegir a nuestras autoridades y a ser electos también. Por ello, es que es importante contextualizar las detenciones arbitrarias que se dan en este momento, y es que se dan precisamente para evitar que las personas detenidas participen en la contienda electoral, y ello desincentiva a la población nicaragüense de participar en el proceso electoral, que algo muy importante es este fin de semana con la verificación electoral ciudadana. Y que estas elecciones se den únicamente entre el partido de gobierno y los partidos que el régimen de Ortega permita participar. Quisiera terminar este día con las siguientes recomendaciones al gobierno de Estados Unidos de América y a ustedes también, honorables miembros de este comité. Y es que se debe obviar esa noción arcaica que predica el régimen de Ortega de una soberanía absoluta. Con la evolución del derecho internacional humanitario, no constituye ningún tipo de injerencia la utilización de mecanismos legales contemplados en el derecho internacional y en el derecho internacional humanitario particularmente, ante la evidente violación a graves violaciones a derechos humanos de los ciudadanos nicaragüenses. Es por ello que los instamos a hacer uso de esos mecanismos legales para lograr que en Nicaragua se respeten los derechos fundamentales de todos los ciudadanos nicaragüenses, iniciando con dos aspectos fundamentales: la liberación de todos los presos políticos y el retorno seguro y con garantía de las personas que nos encontramos en el exilio y que estamos divididos de nuestras familias. Muchas gracias. Buenas tardes, honorables miembros de este comité.
Thank you so very much, Mr. Fornos. And some of us have had translation being done simultaneously, some didn't. But we do know the fervor of your message and the contents of it. So I want to thank you for that so very, very much. I'd like to now begin the questioning, but I do understand, because he didn't get a chance to say anything in the beginning, is Dr. Andy Harris available? I'm sure he'll come back. Let me just begin the questioning then with a few basic questions. To Bianca Jagger, again, I want to thank you for so many very useful suggestions as to what should be done. And I think the visit of the prisoners is something that ought to be very, very aggressively pursued. I remember I was with Armando Valladares, the great Cuban dissident who spent years of his life in Cuban prisons, when and I was in Geneva with him, when he lobbied the United Nations to send a team to investigate the prisons. I was with him for a week. The UN took up that issue, and while the prisoners sadly were mistreated horribly in the Cuban prisons, as they are in Nicaraguans, at least they got the visit. And I'm just wondering, if to Bianca Jagger, if you could speak to the issue of whether or not we should be pushing, the OAS to be doing this. You, I know, should be a part of that, if not the lead of it. Also ask all of you, if you would, is the plight of the destruction of human rights being prioritized enough by the Biden administration, by the European Union? I'll never forget, I'm the one who suggested Leo Chabot, and I led an effort in the Congress to be named for the Nobel Peace Prize. And when I was sitting over dinner with members of the Peace Prize Committee, as they were awarding what turned out to be an empty chair, because the Chinese would not allow Leo Chabot, who had won it, to come, I asked them about Cuba. I asked them about a number of the political prisoners, including Dr. Oscar Bichette, and I was told, Cuba is almost like a paradise. They have great health care. And I said, but they repress just like other dictatorships throughout the world. And I was kind of shocked at it. So I'm wondering, and Bianca, you might be able to speak to this, as to whether or not the plight of the Nicaraguans, especially with you speaking out so boldly and effectively, or at least beginning to turn their sights on what Ortega is doing. So is Biden doing enough? Are we in the United States Congress doing enough? And please be blunt, because, and I know, for the sake of the victims, being excessively polite, which sometimes in this place too many people are, we got to know what we need to be doing. I saw that the Biden administration announced 100 members of the Nicaraguan political and judicial elite were being denied visas. slap on the wrist. You know, it's nice in some times. I'm the one who authored the Belarus Democracy Act of 2004, and visa restrictions was a mainstay of that. It became the template for the Magnitsky Act and Global Magnitsky, which is a good thing. But we're talking about a wholesale destruction of democracy and of a great group of people, the democracy activists and the presidential candidates, that require far more than a visa ban. So if you could speak to that, and whether or not the UN is doing enough. You know, I know that the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, the OAS, they have asked the Inter-American Court on Human Rights to adopt measures to protect the rights of Juan Sebastian Chamorro, Felix Maradiaga, and all the others. What has come of that? They did do a censoring resolution, I know, and I think that's good. But, you know, this is one of those times where we're talking about, you know, this is a full frontal assault of democracy. And if Ortega wins, and as you pointed out, Bianca, yourself, you know, the money they're getting or will be getting from Russia is very destabilizing. It gives them the ability to do more bad things. And I also, if you could, all of you, or perhaps Bianca, because you were the one who brought it up, because I don't think enough, few Americans understand, when, you know, even in the worst of wars that we've ever been involved with, World War II, for example, the medical profession, when somebody is wounded, steps up, as you pointed out, pursuant to the Hippocratic Oath, and they stop the bleeding and try to save that person, even though they are an enemy. Here you have Daniel Ortega doing just the opposite, and then firing those medical doctors who seek to do their Hippocratic Oath inspired job of saving lives. I mean, that is so barbaric. I mean, all the other things, the torture, the electrical prods, all the terrible things they do are unconscionable. But even that, you know, you could disagree with somebody, but even when countries are at war, you know, the Red Cross and medical professionals, you know, are usually allowed to help. And so you could speak to that barbarity, because that only like underscores just how much Ortega and his ilk have deteriorated in this fight. So if you could speak to those issues, I would appreciate it. Bianca, we cannot hear you again. Sorry.
Thank you. Thank you, Congressman, for your pertinent questions. As I said in my presentation, Nicaragua, Daniel Ortega has a state of terror. And you know, when I speak about the atrocities in Nicaragua, you know that I've been in Srebrenica, in Bosnia, in Kosovo, in many countries where I've seen horrible and atrocities. But that Daniel Ortega his atrocities are done with total impunity. And I think that the international community has not really realized to what an extent we are talking about a brutal and about a murderous dictatorship. And when you ask me, I will answer you in order. Have you done enough? Has the US government prior and now done enough? The truth is that the US has done more than many other countries have done. The Magnitsky Act has been very effective to impose that on criminals and corrupt and those egregious human rights violations that have been committed. Was it enough? I think that the one problem that we have is that he has not been coordinated enough. For example, the European Union, despite the fact that they had a very important vote overwhelmingly condemning Daniel Ortega, they were supposed to have a meeting among the Minister of Foreign Affairs to really apply and to make it effective, but that didn't take place for some technical issue, because one of the Foreign Affairs Minister is new and did not bring up the case. So I will say that the only way that we will be able to put an end to what Daniel Ortega is doing and to be effective is when the United States, the US Congress, Canada, and of course the OAS and the European Union are working together. I don't know if I had enough, but I wrote it, how important it will be at this moment if the Secretary General from the United Nations played an important role, if it became a proactive role, if he decided to send a special envoy to Nicaragua. During the 90s, where we had the only free and fair elections in Nicaragua, the United Nations played a critical role. And it will be so important because we can not only demand to Congress and to the US government to do everything. You have done a lot. I hope that you will be able to approve the Renaissance law, that some of those specific things that I mentioned about the NICA Act, and that we really consider that the US government really consider what to do about the CAFTA. The DR CAFTA is really important. And it is not that in any way, and you know that I'm not, as a human rights defender, that I care about how people in Nicaragua are suffering in the plight of the people of Nicaragua. But we need to impose sanctions on this government to be able to weaken it, because at the moment nothing is weakening it, and all he's trying to do is to reach out to the Russian so that he can sort of relive or relaunch again some of Cold War scenario like we had in the past. And then there is something called the SICA, which is something that is among the Central American countries, which will be very important if they could really act and be more effective. And as they did with Honduras a few years ago, if they could really marginalize or maybe bring or expel or temporarily expel Nicaragua from it. I mean, the issue that you have, which I had no time because I knew that time was pressing, is that at the moment the Nicaraguans, if there is no free election, the people are voting with their feet. People are running, they are escaping, they go into Costa Rica, but they come into the US. And you will have Nicaraguan people pleading to be allowed in. I would like to ask Congress to consider a special status for those people in Nicaragua, not to send them back. I know of cases, and I have had to intervene and plead of people who were people who had been prisoners of Daniel Ortega, political prisoners, who were about to be sent back to Nicaragua to be put in prison or maybe to be killed. So there are a number of things, but the most important thing I think is that it be all coordinated. It is to me shocking to think that until now, the OAS has not really played a more effective role. The time has come for the Democratic Charter, for them to apply that to Daniel Ortega, and to please to understand that it is a threat to the national, to the regional security of Latin America, that it is not just for us, the Nicaraguan, it is not just Central America, it's the whole of Latin America, including the US, where you will have more and more people at the doorstep of your borders asking to be allowed to come in. So let's not fool ourselves anymore. The elections, this idea that we are all pursuing and that we are pursuing this sort of, I don't know how, this kind of a dream of an election. We know very well that Daniel Ortega is putting in prison any any presidential candidate, anyone who is an opponent, and that as it is stand at the moment, it is not possible to have election. And we need to begin to think about what shall we do? When should we say enough? We will not pursue this. We will declare, I appeal to members of Congress and to the US government to declare the government of Daniel Ortega illegitimate if there are no elections. Is the intent to have more fraudulent elections like he has had in the past? To all of those who continue to think that Daniel Ortega is this wonderful leftist revolutionary leader, they're dreaming, and they don't even understand that in fact he betrayed all of those promises. Nicaragua had neoliberal policies. I mean, this is not the ideal of what these people who think that we have a revolutionary government that they still to support. I mean, members of Congress, please, I urge you, think about the people who are in jail. Think about the fact that torture is being committed in Nicaragua, that crimes against humanity have been committed with total impunity. Please apply the Renaissance and use the NICA Act and think about how to apply or how to suspend Nicaragua from the CAFTA, from the DR CAFTA.
Thank you. I'd like to recognize Victoria and Berta if they would like to comment on those questions or anything else they'd like to add.
Yes. As Ms. Jagger mentioned, we believe that there cannot be a free and fair election when you have 6 candidates, the more recognized candidates in prison. And we also believe that there's no need to wait until November 7th to realize that we are not in a democratic process. So I truly believe that the international community can point on that and make the regime to understand that we want a peace in a democratic transition through elections. And we want the Nicaraguan people to have the right to elect their leaders, their representatives in a free and peaceful way. That's a call of all Nicaraguans. We believe, I mean, Victoria and I, we're not politicians, of course, but we believe that every country has their public policy. They have a mechanism. They have resources to help the Nicaraguan people to reestablish democracy, and that's what we are asking. The way and the way the countries may do that is decided by the countries. Our only calling is to help us free our husbands, free all the political prisoners, and to reestablish democracy in Nicaragua.
Thank you. I have some additional questions, but I want to yield to my good friend and colleague, Jim McGovern, and then to Andy Harris, and then I'll come back.
Well, thank you, and let me thank all the witnesses here today, and to all those who have loved ones and who have friends who are in Nicaraguan prisons. We, our prayers are with you and with those who are being unjustly held, and I just want to assure Ms. Jagger that there's nobody that I know of here in Congress that thinks Daniel Ortega is wonderful. I think people all know who he really is, what his wife is all about as well, and it really is sad because people in Nicaragua rose up and threw out a terrible tyrant in Somoza, and they ended up with this. It is really it is heartbreaking. And so the challenge is like, how do we proceed here in a way that is effective? First of all, how do we proceed in a way that ensures the safety of those who are unjustly being imprisoned? How do we get them released? And so I will reiterate what Mr. Smith said. Look, we will continue to appeal to Ortega. We will continue to try to coordinate with the international community to demand that these prisoners be released. If you decide that you want to go, we will be wind at your back. We'll go with you. We'll go with you. I doubt very much that he'll let people like us in, But nonetheless, we're happy to press the point because, I mean, this is a no matter what one's politics are, this is a human rights issue that, quite frankly, everybody should be unified on. Everybody who cares about human rights. So that's one. The other challenge is when we talk about the international community, you know, we tend to talk about the United States, Canada, the European Union. Quite frankly, the countries that may be able to exert the most pressure on Mr. Ortega are the Central American countries, because economies are interconnected and intertwined, and there's a lot of overlap there. And so, you know, we need to figure out a way to better coordinate those countries. And quite frankly, countries like El Salvador and Guatemala and Honduras are all having their own issues and human rights challenges right now. But nonetheless, I mean, they need to be part of that discussion. You know, one of the things that, and I don't know if anybody here can can respond to this, but it has always been a puzzle to me that the opposition in Nicaragua has not been able to kind of unify in a way where I think that they could be a more powerful force. Am I misreading that, or I don't know if any of the panelists would want to comment on that? I mean, because it seems to me that you know, there are lots of people who are opposed to the current regime, but there doesn't seem to be the unity, if you will, in terms of the opposition that, quite frankly, I think might make them a more powerful and potent force at this point. I don't know whether Ms. Jagger or anybody on the call or Mr. Fornos,
Yes.
would like to respond. Yeah. Ms.
Yes.
Jagger.
I want to make a comment as, of course, a wife of a candidate. And what my husband always promote was unity. And there is a paper, how do you say, like a letter,
Yep.
where all the candidates signed saying that they commit to support the candidate that were being selected by the people. That means that the opposition, even when we were diverse, were willing to unify and to have one candidate to participate against Daniel Ortega. But what we see in this process is the regime taking away political parties, taking away and putting into prison candidates. The regime didn't let us, the opposition, to really get to that point where we were supposed to have one representative. So I believe that Nicaraguan people really was trying to get to that point, and that there was the willing of the candidates to be unified and to work together to have that Nicaraguan that we dream.
I would like to say, to respond to
Ms.
your
Jagger,
question,
yes.
if I may. The irony of this is that when you see Berta and Victoria, and when you see their husbands who come from very different from a very different political spectrum, and who are together campaigning for the husband. In fact, I think that what Daniel Ortega has succeeded in doing is to unite the opposition against him. It's quite ironic to think that perhaps there was a lot of difficulties, a lot of bickering among them, but that the fact that Daniel Ortega is going after all of them, including the iconic figures who were from the Sandinista revolution, who contributed to liberate him from the jails of Somoza, that has sort of united the opposition. But let's not forget that Daniel Ortega has taken the legal status of all political parties, not only putting them in jail, but as well taking only one political party today, I may be wrong, has a legal status in the country. And so he's doing everything to prohibit that. But I think that who the people were going to decide to have as a leader was about to happen. And that's why he put him in jail.
And am I correct? We don't know the well-being of any of the prisoners. Am I correct? I mean, with that, we don't know. I don't know whether, Mr. Fornos, do we know, has anybody been able to?
I can answer that if you want, Victoria.
Yeah.
In the case of Juan Sebastian and Felix, it's been 43 days and we have not heard or received anything. We don't know where our husbands are, where they are, how they're doing, their whereabouts. We have no information at all.
And if I can ask Mr. Fornos, I mean, there seems to be no justification to hold people incommunicado. You know, I mean, under what law are they saying that they're able to hold people and not allow them to have access to counsel or be able to see any of their family members?
Muchas gracias, Mr. McGovern. I prefer speaking in Spanish for my people in Nicaragua.
Okay.
Ok. La justificación legal que existe es la recién aprobada ley 1060, que es una ley de reforma al Código Procesal Penal que permite hacer una mal llamada audiencia de garantías. Sin embargo, esa audiencia de garantías la enfocan únicamente como el respeto a un plazo de horas de 48 horas desde que son detenidos hasta la presentación del juez. Sin embargo, la audiencia de garantías es mucho más amplia porque se debe garantizar la defensa de la persona que está siendo sujeta de investigación, que la defensa pueda participar en todos los actos de investigación, que la defensa pueda comunicarse libre y privadamente con su defensor. Definitivamente no hay justificación legal alguna, simplemente no están tutelando los derechos fundamentales y del debido proceso de todos los ciudadanos nicaragüenses. Y esta ley 1060 que fue aprobada por la Asamblea Nacional tiene la finalidad única y exclusiva de aplicarse en este contexto como una herramienta de persecución política a través de las instituciones del sistema de justicia penal, como dije en mi primera intervención. Muchas gracias.
Thank you. I think we have a translator here, but because I'm not, my Spanish isn't very good. I don't know if we still have our translator.
I would suggest that Mr. Fornos translate it himself, since he speaks English. Just tell us what he said in English as well.
Are you able to do that, Mr. Fornos?
Yeah, I need the other people translate to Spanish for English, please.
I think we had somebody.
Hello, yes.
Okay, go ahead.
Yes, the Ortega regime reformed the Penal Code Law 1060 with regards to guarantee audience in front of a judge. What used to be 48 hours between arrest and being accused in front of a judge has been extended to 90 days. However, there is absolutely no legal justification for the inexistence of due process. It is a complete violation of the rights of Nicaraguan citizens to have no access to legal counsel. It is a tool of political persecution that the regime has used to completely influence and manipulate the justice system.
Thank you very much. My final question is, I'm trying to think, what is the most important thing we could do right now Because in addition to those who were recently rounded up, there are dozens and dozens and dozens of political prisoners who have been in jail for the last few years. What is the most, what do you think we could do right now that would be most helpful? In addition to organizing appeals, public appeals to the government. If there is an international organization or a human rights organization, or Ms. Jagger, your organization, if you intend to go, we're happy to be wind at your back. But I'm just trying to get a sense for right this moment, the next week, what can members of Congress do that would be most helpful?
Is it possible, or is it too late and will happen only after the recession for the Renaissance legislation to be approved? What do you think?
I didn't hear, what legislation?
Renaissance. The Renaissance. In Congress. RENACER.
Addendum to the NICA Act.
In the NICA Act.
Yeah. I'm not sure what could be. We have another week left in Congress. I think it's a Senate. I think what you're referring to as a Senate bill. But I think in the we recess next week for. So I'm not sure legislatively there's much we could do in terms of protecting Nicaraguans for a year. The Biden administration, with the stroke of a pen, can provide them temporary protected status and not send anybody back. But I think what I'm looking at for is again, we have people who are in jail who we don't know whether they're safe or not, and we want to make sure that we are doing everything we can to make sure that the Nicaraguan government knows that we're focused on this. I'll leave it to people. If people have ideas, you can get, please get a hold of us. But I think, I think this hearing is helpful, but I think at the end of the day, we want to make sure we're doing more than just expressing our indignation, that we're actually following up with something that is meaningful. And the Magnitsky Act, extending the Magnitsky Act to those judges and those responsible for putting people in jail unjustly and illegally, I think that's a good use of the Magnitsky Act as well. And we can appeal to others around the world to follow suit. So, but I would welcome your additional recommendations. And why don't I leave it there and yield back to Mr. Smith?
Thank you very much. I said I'm a good friend from Massachusetts. Is Andy Harris with us still? Okay. Just a couple of questions. The role of the Catholic Church, which has been very positive in many ways over the years. I've noticed that some of the bishops are very concerned about, obviously, the violence, but also violence directed against priests and others. Would any of you want to speak to that issue and what role they might play, particularly amplifying this on the international stage, both in country and out of the country? I've been concerned. When Vice President Harris visited the region, never mentioned, to the best of my knowledge, and I followed her trip very closely, what was going on in Nicaragua, which was a stone's throw away from where she was visiting. Seems to me that would have been a very opportune place to raise these issues and to do it in a very, very clear and profound way. I noticed that Julie Chung, who's the Acting Assistant Secretary of Western Hemisphere, has tweeted about the Ortega regime being responsible for the welfare of detainees. I think we need to ratchet that up far more than what has happened so far to the president, vice president, secretary of state. This is a crisis that is absolutely catastrophic to the people of Nicaragua. I'm all for TPS. I've been for TPS, temporary protective status, since the 1980s, and actually introduced legislation a number of times. And we're trying to get the Bush administration to make sure they extended it to people who were escaping tyranny. But hopefully, if there's a free and fair election, even that need becomes mitigated because, you know, people will have their rights protected at home, which is what they want. So role of the Catholic Church, Mr. Estrada, you mind, or Bianca, anyone who would like to, yes, please.
Yes, I'd like to make a comment.
Let me just go to Bianca first and then to you, Mr. Estrada, if that's okay.
I'll be fine.
Thank you so much.
Congressman, the Catholic Church in Nicaragua is continuously under threat. And I appeal respectfully to the Pope to maybe make a comment on a reference about Nicaragua in protection and support of the Catholic Church in the country. The other thing that I'd like to say with respect to what you just said is that I would like to appeal to President Biden and Vice President Harris, to perhaps both of them, to appeal to the Secretary General of the UN to play a more important role in Nicaragua, because it will only be able to happen if countries such as the US, perhaps European countries, come and request from the Secretary General to play an important role and send an special envoy to the country.
With all due respect, you would make a great special envoy sent there by Gutierrez. So it's something we need to follow up on because I think it's a great idea. I know you're not recommending yourself, but I think you're ready for that job. Mr. Estrada.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Actually, I agree with Ms. Jagger, what she mentioned. I think it's due time, and again, respectfully, ask our Pope to make a statement on what's going on. This persecution against the Catholic Church goes by the same playbook that the Sandinistas played in the 80s. I mean, let's, respectfully to some of the panelists, the Sandinistas were never this romantic ideal. I mean, they were supported by at that point, Soviet Union. They were a communist Marxist movement from the get-go. They had instructors from Cuba and the Soviet Union. They worked with Venezuela. Unfortunately, back then, even though we had a democracy in Venezuela, there were some issues among the two heads of states, and they fought against, we know very well, against the President Somoza. Regarding the church, this persecution is not new to the playbook of the Sandinistas. And I think if I can make a comment also on what Chairman McGovern was saying, what else can we do, and why hasn't the opposition united? Those are very good questions, and the answer that 70% of Nicaraguans will give you. There's very little faith, very little trust in the political class right now in Nicaragua. We have certain individuals who, yes, absolutely, they do want the best for Nicaragua, and they have been active in the pursuit of justice, not the pursuit of power. But unfortunately, we tend to see the same players in this. I mean, we have to start thinking also of a post-Ortega Nicaragua. Are we going to have a more inclusive, open society, open government to allow more of its citizens participate in politics? Or are we going to continue with the same exclusive attitude about forbidding by default other citizens to participate? There was Philip Gallup, I believe, a few months ago. They had they had a poll, like who was supported. Over 70% of the Nicaraguan people that were asked, they supported none of the political players that were at that point aspiring to go into politics or were in politics. You have situations, and this dismantling of the institutions of the government, they're not new to Daniel Ortega. This has happened throughout the history of Nicaragua. You have certain groups of people who control the institutions, who control the economy, and they do not allow other members of society to participate. And I say, I make that comment to, very good friends, some diplomats and other government officials, such as yourself. It's very heartbreaking to see so many students going to college, going to these universities with great sacrifice, and then they come out having studied political science or engineering, and they can't get any job, they can't get work, simply because they don't have somebody to pick up the telephone and say, hey, give a position in the government to my son or my nephew and so forth. But anyway, as far as what can the US do, I think it's important and it is fair to also ask, what else can Nicaraguans, what else can we do, both inside Nicaragua and outside Nicaragua? I think it's important to also mention, and I mean this respectfully also, the private sector in Nicaragua has been very cohesive with the Ortega government. It's no surprise. I mean, it's why they have also resisted in calling out for an all-out strike, meaning shutting down their businesses, as they did with Somoza. They shut down their businesses indefinitely. They have refused to do that also here with Daniel Ortega. If we're going to be frank and honest, and we are being sincere about pursuing a solution to this chaos in Nicaragua, we have to address all those issues. If we're going to go ahead and have a quick fix and say, get Ortega out, and then we'll see what happens next, we are going to repeat the same mistake. We're going to be in the same vicious cycle. Once again, we have an election, we have a new president, and then what happens? The same people are going to be involved in government, and then we isolate other members of the Nicaraguan community, and we continue with the same vicious cycle, and sooner or later, we're going to end up right back here where we are now, with a dictatorship in the government, with a society who is poor, that can barely afford to eat, and with the international, and asking actually the international community to come and fix our mess. So I think those are all points that need to be addressed if we're going to be sincere about having a lasting change in Nicaragua.
Thank you for that very sobering analysis, Mr. Estrada, and recommendations, and I really do. We all appreciate that very much. I understand Sheila Jackson Lee is recognized. Sheila, she was on a moment ago. Okay, I thank her for being on and to be a part of this.
Can be federally criminal. Is it federal enclave?
Sheila, you're hooked in with another hearing, it sounds like. Did you want to speak and ask any questions? Hello? Okay, at this point, when Mr. Fornos provided his testimony, we did not have translation, at least most of us. Some of us had it in our ear with someone speaking. But I would like to offer the opportunity, if you'd like, to have his English translation of what he said in his original testimony. And I have no further questions. So if Bianca, I don't know how late it is over there for you in the UK, but I do thank you. I thank Mr. Estrada and all of our very distinguished witnesses. But I would like to, unless you had final comments you wanted to make before we go to that translation, Bianca, anything that you'd like to add before we close?
Just to say thank you very much for having me.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
Thank you.
And I think reaching out to the Pope is an excellent idea. We really, Mr. Estrada, thank you for that. I think we need to, there needs to be some strong statements made, because it's happening, a lot of the oxygen in the room is being snuffed out because of the focus on Cuba, which is in the news more and more. But that doesn't mean Ortega gets away with murder, because eyes are averted elsewhere. I would note that in about an hour, I'll be with Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, who's the one woman who won the Belarusian election last August. At least we believe that. It was hijacked by Lukashenko. And with the record, I wrote 4 laws on democracy in Belarus. It's beginning with the Belarus Democracy Act of 2004, which puts sanctions and all kinds of other things, visa bans on individuals. And And it just seems like it's replicated. If we don't really focus like a laser beam on confronting human rights abuse, and most importantly, are sustainable in that. Lukashenko, like Ortega, like Castro, like Xi Jinping and others, just expect there to be a blow up for a while. Then the international community turns the page and the abuse goes on unabated and unfocused on. So Bianca, I do promise you, and I know there are many other congressmen and women and senators who feel the same way. We're going to keep pushing very hard. And again, your testimony has been outstanding. I think your focus on the legislation that is moving over on the Senate side is a good one. It's a comprehensive attempt to really focus on Nicaragua. Thank you for reminding us all of that. So if there's anybody else on the line that would like to make a final
I just wanted to say, Chairman Smith, thank you very much for taking the time to host this hearing in such an important matter that we have to deal with. I think everyone deserves the right to have human dignity. And I also want to thank Ms. Bianca Jagger for her wonderful work that she has been doing for her native land, Nicaragua. Thank you.
Thank you. And Berta and Victoria, by the way, did have to go on to another meeting, but thank you especially to them for their testimonies. And of course, Mr. Fornos, thank you for yours as well. I would like to ask the translation of Mr. Fornos's original testimony, which some of us did not get to hear.
Good afternoon, Co-Chair Smith, Co-Chair McGovern. Thank you for holding this hearing and for inviting me to testify. My name is Bianca Fornos. I'm a Nicaraguan lawyer here today representing Acción Penal, Penal Action, a civil society initiative created by former public prosecutors to defend political prisoners and provide legal assistance to victims of state and paramilitary repression in Nicaragua. Since April 18, 2018, Nicaragua has experienced one of the most serious crises in the history of the Republic. Since he returned to the presidency in 2007, Daniel Ortega has dismantled institutional independence, evidenced in its maximum expression as of April 2018. The Nicaraguans who protested against the government were politically targeted and criminalized through criminal proceedings ordered by Ortega, aimed at shutting down the mass expressions of discontent that were weakening the legitimacy of the government and putting at risk their intention to permanently remain in power. The Ortega government instrumentalized the criminal justice system to become a repressive arm of the executive branch, acting in coordination with paramilitary forces. The police selectively and systematically carry out actions to arbitrarily detain people who participated in civic protests. The prosecutor's office charges activists and opposition leaders with unfounded accusations, while the public defender's office has neglected to defend many of the accused. Judges and magistrates fail to fulfill their responsibilities as constitutional guarantors, leaving unquestioned the legality of the actions taken by the police and the prosecutor's office. This system represents the inexistence of due process and the rule of law in Nicaragua. For example, political prisoners are not allowed ongoing and private communication with their defense attorneys. In the courts, the judges exclude evidence that favors the accused and disproves the false accusations made by the prosecutors. The penitentiary system does not guarantee respect for the health and physical integrity of political prisoners, demonstrated clearly with the assassination of U.S. citizen and Navy veteran Eddie Montes, carried out by penal guards inside the prison facility that they are responsible for. This crime has still gone unpunished. During the pandemic, political prisoners have not been given necessary items to protect themselves from COVID-19, which is especially grave considering the overcrowding and unsanitary conditions that make prisoners more vulnerable. We have heard from family members that there have been cases of political prisoners testing positive for COVID-19, as well as other illnesses that require urgent medical attention, which the authorities have denied. In its work, Acción Penal has seen that the human cost of repression extends not only to political prisoners, but to their families as well. At the beginning of the crisis, most of the political prisoners came from families with limited economic resources, but wanted to make change in the government's course of actions. There were mothers who didn't have money to travel to court or went without eating that day so that they could bring food for their detained relative. There was solidarity on the part of other people and the lawyers who, seeing that these mothers had no resources, supported them to access food and transportation. These are the realities of Nicaragua over the past 3 years, and this is what drives us to continue our work. As the crisis has worsened, the lawyers who defend political prisoners are also facing risks and threats. The government tries to suspend our ability to practice law and criminalizes us using the argument that we are foreign agents and traitors to the homeland because our work allows us to document the serious human rights violations happening in Nicaragua and evidence which is used to denounce these crimes in settings like this hearing. If they go after us criminally, current political prisoners will be left without legal defense. And as lawyers, we will have no guarantee for due process. For this reason, many lawyers who defend political prisoners have been forced into exile. Ahead of this year's elections, the latest stage of repression is clearly designed to de facto inhibit potential electoral candidates, not just for the presidency, but other positions. This is a strategy that starts with the approval of punitive laws by the National Assembly and is then executed by the police, prosecutors, judges, and public offenders who are politically subordinate to the Ortega regime, seriously violating the right that Nicaraguans have to elect and be elected. The arrests that have occurred over the past month are intentional so as to ensure that electoral candidates are unable to participate and to discourage the Nicaraguan population from voting in the elections, thus leaving only the ruling party and their political allies. I would like to end my testimony today with the following recommendation to the United States government. The archaic notion of absolutist sovereignty preached by the Ortega government in response to the alleged foreign interference in the internal affairs of Nicaragua must be ignored. With the evidence of the existence of serious human rights violations, it is important to make use of the existing mechanisms in international law, particularly international humanitarian law, to ensure that the fundamental rights of Nicaraguans are respected, beginning with the release of political prisoners and the safe return of those of us who are in exile. Thank you.
Very much, Mr. Fornos. Rafael, did you have something? I thought you're muted.
I was listening to the statement, and I was saying good job.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I was saying good job, and I want to thank him also for helping and assisting fellow Nicaraguans here in the U.S. So, but anyway, thank you again, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate, and I know that I speak for many people, some of those people that we have been engaged with in other countries, as you know, I mentioned in my statement. And my written statement is actually a bit longer than what I read on, you know, when I spoke, when I had the chance to read the statement here in the hearing. I do think it is important that the U.S. engages more aggressively with the situation in Nicaragua. What Ms. Jagger was trying to mention was the addendum, basically, of the NICA Act, which is the Renacer Act, which imposes more sanctions a bit more aggressively than originally intended. However, to this date, none of them have been affected. And as I was saying, and I meant this respectfully, I wasn't trying to criticize too heavily on the private sector, but more than one institution, let's say, have been more than concerned about the attitude of the private sector in Nicaragua. When President Trump's administration, when they were considering to remove Nicaragua from the DR-CAFTA, excuse me, there was quite a problem, I guess, with the private sector in Nicaragua. And I say this respectfully to them, and for them to rethink, you know, their position. I mean, somehow it seems that they want to keep doing business as usual, and that's not the situation. If we are going to have a sincere dialogue about how to change Nicaragua, we do have to engage in a way that we are thinking of post-Daniel Ortega. Otherwise, as I said previously, we're going to be stuck in the same cycle. Daniel Ortega didn't get to have all this power. He controls all of the branches of government. the institutions. There are no institutions any longer in Nicaragua. Everything is partisan. Everything now has to go through the channels of government. If you want to do any business, if you can be on a list which forbids you basically and prevents you from going about your business. That has to change. But what I'm saying, he did not come to that power overnight. This is because he had the collaboration of many players there in Nicaragua who were in the political class and in the private sector. Some of the people who oppose President Ortega now were former business associates, former allies of Daniel Ortega. And now, as you may see, many are up in arms saying, oh, this man is a dictator. Granted, obviously he is. I mean, we do not have a democracy in Nicaragua, but he is part of he is a product of the persistent corruption in the political class. So I think it is fair, and I mean that for the United States as well. The US has the tendency to always communicate and engage with the same groups in Nicaragua. That, I think, has to change. They have to address also other groups that have not been in the spotlight. Give a chance to other groups that don't have the opportunity to go ahead and get on a plane and fly to Washington, D.C. Unless we open this up and engage with other citizens of Nicaragua, this will never change. We're going to be back here again in a few years. If we do have elections, if we do get to have a democratic government in Nicaragua, unless we make those changes, we're going to be back here again, Mr. Chairman. And that's what, unfortunately, what I see happening. Seems that we are engaging with the same group. There are over 6 million Nicaraguans, and most of them are not represented by the current political leaders, let's say. During every administration, and I encourage you guys to check this out, to verify it. During every administration, even during Bolaños and Alemán and Violeta Chamorro, you will see the same individuals holding government positions. And as I said, so many students that go through so much sacrifice and study, they come out with their careers and their diplomas. They have no chance to be part of the government because they don't belong to that group of people who have been there for quite a while and shut that door of opportunity to so many other Nicaraguans. So I guess that's my point. I think it's bigger than just Ortega. I think we need some serious and sincere cultural changes in the political class and as a whole, I think, in the whole society of Nicaragua.
Thank you very much. Bianca? Thank you. Nothing to add. I do want to thank our distinguished witnesses. You've given us so much to think about, many wise recommendations to follow up on. So thank you for that. This hearing, I think, will really help all of us know better what to do, how to do it, and when, which is right now, to get on it immediately. So thank you so very, very much. Look forward to working with all of you going forward. This hearing of the Lantos Commission is adjourned. Thank you. Again, folks.